Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Now that there's more people here that I don't know, I'll introduce myself. My name is Dave Antis, Director of University Ministry. I appreciate you coming out in this crazy weather for what I imagine will be a very enlightening and engaging evening. Just one note, after the presentation tonight, if you'd like to read a copy of the Charter for Compassion and then add your name, your signature to the list of dozens of UDM faculty, staff, and students who have already done so, you'll find a table right outside of our office up these stairs. Please feel free to take a copy of the Charter. We're highlighting this document at Celebrate Spirit tomorrow at Callahan Hall. So please feel free to take a copy and add your signature. So our speaker tonight, I first heard of Dr. Keshavarz. She was interviewed by Krista Tippett on a show called On Being on NPR. And I found myself fascinated by her enthusiasm and love for Rumi, the 13th century Muslim mystic and poet. She clearly has a passion for poetry, but also a passion for peace and justice, which make an excellent combination here for the University of Detroit University. As far as her biography, Dr. Keshavarz is director of the Roshan Institute of Persian Studies and holds the Roshan Institute Chair in Persian Studies at the University of Maryland. She's the author of award-winning books including Reading Mystical Lyric, Reciting the Name of the Red Rose, and a book of literary analysis and social commentary entitled Jasmine and Stars, Reading More Than Lolita in Tehran. Dr. Keshavarz is a published poet in Persian and English and an activist for peace and justice. She was invited to speak at the UN General Assembly on the significance of cultural education. And the NPR show that I mentioned before, The Ecstatic Faith of Rumi, brought her the Peabody Award in 2008. And that same year, she also received the Herschel Walker Peace and Justice Award. So we're ecstatic to have her here tonight. So please help me welcome Dr. Fatemeh Keshavarz.
Thank you all for coming out in this unusual weather. I have to just say at the outset that anything that I did for peace and justice, if I did anything, came from the passion that came from the peace community to say to it. And I went out to a few people and said, we need to stop another war. The war in Iraq was going on, and everyone was terribly concerned that one of the main targets was Iran. So suddenly friends came out of nowhere, and they just spent day and night. We read on the streets. We just got together in campuses, and I met some of the finest people I've ever known in my life. And not a single one of them was Iranian, by the way. So it was a kind of connection with the humanity, with being human, with wanting to prevent violence. A lot of poetry also came out of that. And maybe for the first time, really, I, in my head, made sense of this famous line that's by an Iranian poet called Ahmad Shamlu, who was one of the great poets of the 20th century, who said, I am a poet, I alter the world. And that group of people, the work we did, just on a very minute scale happening there, made me see the proportions of what you could do with words, with poetry, with sincerity of expressing who you are and what you're hoping to do. Now, I was just before some of you came in, was telling some of the friends who have been here that I grew up in a situation that may not be, very, or maybe unsimilar or dissimilar or whatever is the word for it, with some of the situations that in other cultures or countries people have experienced, but I'm sure it has some parallels as well. I grew up in the city of Shiraz in southwest of Iran, and basically I could not imagine life without poetry. It was a people who specialized in it, and you could listen to them, and they would be speaking about it very intelligently. And others would relate to it, maybe not on that high level, but it didn't belong to any particular expert. It was everyone's. It was a part of life. The only thing I can really compare it to in our current environment here is, and I sometimes say this, in a book that is just going to come out about the poetry of Fatemeh Keshavarz, one of the great master lyric writers of my hometown. I call this poetry the information superhighway of the Persian-speaking world. It was a net of ideas, of thoughts, of philosophies, of information that these people shared and could get connected to and hear each other's voice. In a slightly less technological and more romantic, you could call it the Silk Road of the imagination, because it really connected China to the Mediterranean. You could go somewhere, let's say you were going to the city of Bukhara or Samarkand, you were going to a place in Tajikistan, and you were traveling from Isfahan. You knew that if you had a beautiful Azhar Sadi by heart, that someone over there is going to recognize you. If you knew it at a specialized level, you might be even invited to give a lecture. You might be even invited, even if you wrote your own poetry and you were really good at it, the local ruler might even be interested in having you in their company and in the company of the people who came to see him. So it was there on that level, and it connected us over the centuries and time in ways that maybe not so easy to describe. Let me give you an example. If my mother was very upset with something we had done, she would look a little bit, angry and say, which means trying to discipline a rascal is like trying to balance a walnut on top of a dome. It's from Sadi. It's a famous line of Sadi, who got at some point frustrated with the students and wrote this. Now, I heard this from way before I knew who Sadi was, and I was really interested in reading Sadi. But something else that was in that poem was that, in that rolling down of the walnut from the dome, there was a kind of laughter. You knew that. I knew that my mother wasn't really that angry. This connection of the beauty of the words, the laughter in there, and at the same time, the lesson that it gave was that complex. And I think one of the most important things that came out of this web of ideas is that the readers and the speakers of this language, they were able to imagine themselves as members of a community which was larger than the polity in which they lived. Why? Because Sadi had said, seasoned lands are numerous and people in them are men. And he had traveled 30 years of his life. So you knew there's a war of it out there. It's complex. And yourself, your being, had to be humble in the presence of this bigger world. It was not fashionable, and I'm sure there were many bad fashionable things, but it was not fashionable to just focus on your individual self and be the greatest being in the world. But it was fashionable to be a self that was humbled by the presence of the others and acknowledge them, seek knowledge and learning from them, and disseminate any kind of knowledge you could have. Now, I was telling my gracious host today that I consider myself extremely lucky that television came to our house when I was probably 14, 15. So I had been past the stage where these poets visited every night. They came from, 12th century or Khorasan or next door. Somebody was reading something, somebody was reciting something, somebody was having an argument with somebody and quoting a line, and, so it happened all the time. And so way before I started to read Julia Kristeva or, I don't know, many, Michel Foucault or others, I knew that good poetry is that which frees itself from the page and becomes a part of your life. If it stays imprisoned in a book, there's something wrong. Or it's just not, it's not up to the task, it's not able to do the job. Also, there were other ways. You would go to the bazaar, the fabric bazaar, the merchant had a beautiful line written out and framed and put on the wall. Or you went to the class to practice something, you got these lines. But the family part of it was really important to me. I'll give you another example from my mother, because I particularly got the love of poetry of Sadi from my mother. And my mother was a very reticent, very reserved individual. And I don't want to give the impression that the old Middle Eastern mothers are like that, from gender. But she was. To her, you didn't express your love in words so much. You would give someone a sweater. You would cook them a nice dish. You would do something like that, because if you really used your word, it somehow took away from the value of this emotion. So I always activated, really created the situation where we could have a game of mushairi or poetry reading. So my mother would recite Sadi, because then she was a different person. It would be the most beautiful, the most sensual, the most open words of a poet. And it was perfectly all right for her to have the voice of Sadi and the voice of herself mingle and speak in that new voice. And Sadi is a quite actually attractive figure, I think. When David heard me, I was very much in the Rumi mode, and I still am, but Sadi is definitely a very, very, when he does my program on the radio. I'm very, very much now also a Sadi person, because what he did with his poetry, again, went beyond just teaching a few philosophical points. He had a great sense of humor. Would say to the beloved, I'm broken-hearted for you. I'm not going to go to anyone else. You cannot mend a broken golden vessel with glue. So he was the gold vessel. He himself, he was way away from the kind of pale, heartbroken, helpless lover that we sometimes imagine that the very poetry of the time. So this is one of my mother's favorite poems that I translated. Someday I will find my way to those lovely curls. Of your sweet lips alone, I will tell 100 savory tales. Do you wish to be unkind? Here, I have only one life, considering yours. Or if you wish to stay, I'll spread it like a carpet beneath your feet. Repentance and restraint are not the way to reckon with your love. From this moment on, I promise to never repent. You say, sit in sorrow till the end of your days, or rise and give yourself to love. Whatever you say, my dear, I'll sit and rise, and sit and rise. Without you, paradise is a place I will not go near. If in hell you are with me, I do not mind its blazing fire. So, This voice, the voice of Sagi, also criticized kings, but also praised some kings. It gave the most ethical lessons. It made fun of himself. He says that he was a young child, a young 12-year-old, 13-year-old, and he used to get up very early and do the early morning prayer, Muslim prayer, which has to be done before dawn. And one day he was so pleased with himself that, a lot of people in the house were sleeping. His father was up and he was praying. So he turns around to his father and he says it in a very literary, gracious way. None of these folks rise to offer a humble morning prayer to the Lord. So deep are they in their heedless slumber that they might as well be dead. And the father does not waste a moment. He says, if you have risen to spy on others, judging by what you just said, you too, my dear son, would be better off in bed. So it's really the kind of ethics that, well, this is criticizing the kind of pretentious practice that says if you don't pray if you miss a single prayer, you're not a proper Muslim, or if you see someone, you have the right to judge them and say they're not good and so on. So he really, with these very loving words that you can see in his lyrics, at the same time, you can see that he demolishes these false constructions of piety and self-praise and social grandness and the embodiment. I think if you ask me what came out of those years, and obviously I went to the study of literature, I did a PhD, and I'm teaching it, so clearly that was something that I fell in love with and followed in a serious way. But if you ask me, what is one really important thing you think about poetry, I will go back to what I said about the peace community. Poetry is engaged with life. You may learn a set of, I can say this actually about art in general. You can learn a set of techniques and try to do them very well. You can even do scholarship without being heavily involved with the scholarship is also engaged. But you cannot write real poetry unless you are engaged in life. And you're asking significant questions, which I think is another point I would like to really bring up in relation to the poems, and that is, I would define one such thing as looking with intent. To look at life with intent. To see the smallest things around us and realize that they matter and that life is about the smallest components of it. Now, I think we are brought up, and by I don't just mean here in the American community, everywhere almost in the world, we're brought up with this desire to carry impossible acts of bravery and heroism, which could be good, one could do it, but very often they're impossible. They're impossible, so therefore we give our heroes supernatural powers. They can fly, they can hide in ways that, ordinary people can't. And therefore, we always feel that we're so far from being that hero. I want to read you a poem, which actually is one of the first poems I ever wrote in English, because it took me a long time. I was in this country for about 20 years before I wrote my first poem in English, and I never know why someday I gave myself the permission to do it. Maybe my children grew up and became enough of the real natives. I don't know that's a word, but actually culturally belonging that I felt I could use that language. But this is one of the first things I wrote. It is about lighting a fire, the size of a flower pot, big enough to warm a single room perhaps, a few cold fingers and toes now and then, and a frozen heart once in a blue moon, if luck gives a helping hand. 'Tis about being here. 'Tis about being here in the true sense of the word, with a kind of unwavering attention that does not leave a blade of grass unnoticed. 'Tis about taking the time to deliver a piece of cake to a not-so-poor middle-class family whose collective memory has been invaded by tuition, rent, insurance, and antibiotics, and realizing that even pastry shops around the corner can be forgotten permanently. It's not about disclosing the world of poverty, though it would be good if someone did, or battling hunger, disease, and ignorance in those whose mass misery is a mirror in its horrendous clarity, reflecting the greed of a gluttonous few. Some things are hard to acknowledge. Tears are for those who are beyond hope to live. But anything short of stunned silence is disrespectful of those who have no place in which to die. And there are those who do not have a place in which to die. And they die on the street. Some things are simply enormous. For ants, mountains do not define the horizon. It is not about heroes. Single acts of heroism and bravery raise too much dust. Think of the resulting poor visibility and all the cleaning to be done after. It is about letting life flow through you. It is about letting life flow through you with a kind of glow, a kind of fresh, vibrant smile that can only fit on a most ordinary. The kind of shy, unpretentious reaching out that comes from living a mass bigger than your own body. It is about looking within. Now, I think that this part is probably very much addressed to us and to those of you who will be in classroom, Charlotte, someday soon. Because many of us feel that these classrooms have to be brought to life. Just the same way that poems need to be out of books and in real life, education needs to be brought to life by connecting aspects of our lives which are easy to leave behind, to be anxious about, to be depressed about, to be unable to voice that it isn't a part of the public, it isn't a part of the education to go through. Now, be surprised if you like, but I really think that the humanities will be the crown of our university education in not so very long a time, because we need it. We absolutely, desperately need, and we need to be teaching these in order to be able to live meaningful, wholesome lives that are connected to our education system. And then, while teaching poetry, I realized that one can look at the ideal situations and hope that that would happen for us in the classroom, but I want to give you an example of something that I've done in the classroom and has been very rewarding to me. For the past 10 years, I have taught a course called Lyrics of the Mystical Love, East and West. And we basically go to classroom and say, what is mysticism? Start reading on cognition, understanding of something that's a concept which science wants to unravel that. And please don't think I'm anti-science. I think we absolutely love all those wonderful scientists that we have. But this urge to unravel everything, to never allow ourselves to be perplexed, to never allow ourselves to say what is before me is really larger than me, and I'm humbled by it, and I'm perplexed. So we address that, we try to read it from different angles. We talk about poetry, about voicing your visions, voicing your love for life, or your love for God, depending on who we are reading, and we keep reading all these poets along the way. And then we ask a question, why is it that all these mystics who talk about silence write so much poetry? Well, they could just be silent. So we talk about the idea of engaging the act of speaking. And what does it do for us? Now, I always keep what people write at the end of these classes, because they say things about themselves that really makes me feel, I hope they just take this and follow it out and think about it. There've been a couple of career changes. Some people decided to do literature, but of course that's a very small number compared to everyone who takes the course. But one time when I finished, and we do pretty complex things. We talk about unspeaking, unsaying concepts. We talk about apophatic traditions, non-really, about contradiction in language. We talk about pretty hard stuff, and we Rumi, with John Cross, Meister Eckhart, Hebrew poets. We just try to see how these people engage the act of speaking. We also watched a short 20 minutes video called The Story of Stuff. Has anyone watched it? The Story of Stuff. I would highly recommend that. That is because as you read the poetry, you see that what these people are asking for is decluttering their lives. Whatever it is. Too much need for approval, too much fear of being on your own, disability to voice your feeling, whatever it is that is cluttering their lives, that is holding them down. We read about that. Then that video talks about how things invade our lives and how they are in some ways so closely connected with those other things. Now, I'm not saying that that's a psychoanalysis class, or, we're healing people, nothing at all like that. But it is a way of saying this poetry is about you. This mysticism is not a mist on some distant mountain. These people ask compelling questions about who am I? What am I doing here? What is the meaning of my life? And what am I doing with this life? And so all of that applies. You can look for your own answers. And in fact, it's only answers if you look for your own answers. They never give you the answer. We read the Conference of the Birds of Attar, the medieval Persian poet and mystic. It's about the story of birds who, I don't know how did anyone see, because it was made into a beautiful musical theater by Peter Brook and afterwards performed elsewhere. Okay. It's the story of birds coming together and saying, we don't have a king, we want to find our king. And they have heard the legend of Seymour, the phoenix, the legendary bird living in Mountain Cove, in a distant mountain. They found a cuckoo, and a bird which has feathers on its head, so it was like acting like a guide to go there. It was tough. Some halfway through said, the nightingale said, oh, I'm in love with Rose, I have to stay here. Another one said, Butivar had said, I am sad, I have to sit and watch my sea, I can't travel, I don't have the energy. So these are all types. Okay. They get there. When they get there to see this ignore or this legendary bird, there is no bird there. There is a miracle. There's some kind of a luminous presence. And in that presence, they see themselves. But interestingly enough, in Persian, they are see more, which means 30 birds. In Persian, see means 30 and more means bird. So they are see more, but they are see more, the legendary bird. In other words, they can only be their own truth. Book was not going to tell them who the true king is, and so on and so forth. So the same, these ideas come out of the class. And so in one of the classes at the end, I said to the students, okay, actually it was last year, I said, okay, say something about that class. You don't have to be profound, you don't have to be mystical, you just say something about it. Somebody said, this course was about my life. It was about the questions I had. Another person said, in the discussion, I learned so much from my peers. I had no idea they could teach me so much. The student said, in my science classes, the correct answers are clearly defined. Here, we often have many different answers. So this was a computer science major. Another student said, I thought about material attachments, about my life being cluttered with things. Another student said, this was a PhD student, actually they would take it and they had to do extra work. Halfway through the course, I realized we were tackling some really complicated concepts. The readings were pretty hard, but everyone, even the undergrads, seemed to understand them. We did, of course, take very small pieces and pull it apart. And these poets were great in giving you tangible examples. There's a medieval Persian mystic who says, everyone asks me if there's a difference between a Muslim and a Christian and a Jew and I don't, they don't understand me when I say there is no difference. Okay, imagine there's a circle and we are on the circumference and we are moving towards the center. And they say, why are we so different from one another? The further we are from the center, the further we are also from each other. The closer we get to the center, the closer we get to each other. And if we get somewhere, there is no difference between us, then we are the same. So they use a lot of such allegorical language. And one thing that I really highlighted in the class of this was the significance of hope. You cannot be engaged unless you keep the hope alive. And if you realize the biggest dictators, the worst kinds of people who do the most horrible things, one of the things they try to do is to destroy hope, to say that whatever you do, you're not going to get it. Well, the mystics did the opposite. They said there's a great anecdote about Rumi that one day he was sitting with some of his disciples around him. They did that in the garden very often. They put their feet in the water. They sat there and talked. And someone was not talking, so Rumi said, why is so-and-so not talking today? And somebody said, Your Holiness, or whatever they called him, he's sad. So Rumi thought for a second and then said, what has sadness got to do anything with us? That thief was hanged at my threshold a long time ago. Now, they used to hang thieves at the threshold of the king, of the palace, so that everyone knows who has the authority to. But when you think about it, it's such a precise metaphor. What does sadness do? It steals your energy. It steals your ability to do things. And so with these metaphors, with these step-by-step use of language, students come to actually see. These are tools, very important tools about rebuilding their lives. And you know, there's one image that I absolutely love about that Louis has used in one of his sermons. He says, each one of us is a Mary, and we have a Jesus inside. If we don't give birth to our own Jesus, nothing will happen. It's connected to the truth. But we will be remain deprived. We have to carry this pregnancy with goodness and truth to terms and give birth to our own truth. And he does it with language, because that's how these bridges are built. Excuse me. Understandings are shaped, struggles take place, and ultimately meaning is created, is generated. So one of the struggles we have in that class is that language is not a suitcase. It does not carry meaning for you. You can't open it and take the meaning out. The meaning generates in your interaction with the text. You are part of the generator of this meaning. And therefore, you are a creator in some way. You're pregnant with your own Jesus in the metaphor. And so, let me end by a poem that I dedicate to the students of that class. And it is called When a Poem Comes Your Way. I beg you to leave behind your imagined suitcases, to give up the thought that words carry pieces of meaning inside them, the way one's luggage carries one's shirt, shoes, or underwear. I want you to play at the meaning as it comes at you from unexpected corners, the way kids play with their new ball without a single care about hitting the most respectable glass window in the neighborhood. There is a kind of boom, a juvenile forbidden joy in breaking things that mesmerize you with their boldness. Great words, thoughts, and ideas into reason. Particularly when their sharp edges threaten to cut the skin. And watch for the treasures that emerge from the ruin. I want you to walk barefoot on the sidewalks of life, the way intoxicated dervishes walk on pieces of broken glass or burning coal. I want you to live as if every ray of light flows in your veins, as if every leaf falls at your feet, and every bird can pull you up to the sky. I want you to listen. I want you to listen as if every blade of grass is singing, and talk as if the world is listening. When a poem comes your way, I want you to run your fingers along the uneven edges of its concreteness. Inhale its aroma, taste its bitter anguish, and walk with its comforting flow. There comes a time when you learn to be hungry for listening. Why not swallow poems whole, the way boa constrictors swallow their prey, and live on it through the wintry hunger games of thought? Truth be told, I want you to become pregnant with a poem for a while, for as long as you need, for what is your gestation period. Then give birth to your own meaning, as if you conceived, as if there never was a another poet in the world. I want you to be the lead.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. We have time for some questions. So I'll bring the mic around if you want to raise your hand.
Early in your talk, you made a comment about the scientific worldview, and it reminded me of something I was reading just recently. Karen Armstrong at Harvard argued at one point that with reference to Christian biblical interpretation, that the dominant mode in use of Scripture in medieval times was allegorical, but biblical literalism arose from her point of view with the scientific method, because all of a sudden people wanted the empirical proof of some specific answer. How, in your view, how do we live with balancing this desire for empirical proof in our, which we see manifest in so many ways in our lives, with the sort of multivalent engagement with meaning that you're describing here?
Well, you know, I absolutely agree that there is an interconnection there, and that the need for that empirical knowledge and certainty is also very important, and of course has been at the foundation of many, many things that we have achieved. But I think the way to get away from it is to understand the simplicity of binary opposition and to avoid them. Because we are brought up on one or the other concept. We may think that we have got much more complex now, in some ways maybe we have, but it is still one or the other. Whereas in fact, in the work of the great scientists and the great philosophers and the great poets, there is enormous overlap of the way they work. So I would say that two things we really need to get away from, and poetry is one thing that's tremendously helpful in, if we could take it to classroom without scaring people away, because when I first started teaching these, my colleagues told me, don't put too much of this in your course description, the students are going to be scared. But you know why? Because it was read and studied in such a way that it really didn't seem to have much overlap in life. With some highly elitist, beautifully put together construction that we try to understand it on its own terms. So we could manage to take into the classroom art, fiction, poetry, and really enliven the pedagogical methodology with creative ways of connecting with each other. I think that is one. It would immediately take us away from one or the other. One question I'm frequently asked is, why were all those mystics so much against rationality? They were not. They were not. They believed that rationality will take you a certain way. There is a limit to what you could do with your rationality. There is a force called love that is even more powerful. So don't ignore it. But it wasn't get rid of one and bring the other one in. In fact, when he has a beautiful metaphor, he says, if you have a piece of fabric, you need to find a good tailor to make it for you. Use your rationality to find the best tailor in town. Knock on the door when you found it, give the material for it to make the tailor is love. So you find you still very much need all that, that it's not either or, but I think back to the point you're making. There is a great German Christian theologian, I'm trying to remember her name, Dorothy Soul. And she says, we are suffering from hermeneutics of suspicion. We can't give it up. Anything you say, people are looking for a truth value in that. Can I factually prove this? Okay, that's one way. That's one way of approaching life. And there are many, many, many other ways. There are stories that have no connection with truth, but have guided lives, have saved lives, and have built lives. Should we ignore them? You know, so, or even she talks about, even looking at Christianity, those who are the opposite, you know, who are very critical, are always looking at how can we prove this. In fact, people do this about Islam or any other religion. And she has a book that I would actually highly, highly recommend. It's called Mysticism and Resistance. And in which she talks it looks at a huge range of methodological approaches that address limitations that come from, I would call it actually scientism, not really scientific, because scientific would be broad enough. It would take into consideration the other, you know, all the other aspects of faith. So I would think that just bringing those wise voices from within tradition. You know, in the same class, I teach the work of a Benedictine nun called Joan Chittister. Some of my students are like, why isn't she leading the order? You know, why is she a Benedictine nun? You know, why? Because it's that binary opposition. I didn't know I could nun, and to say yes to everything and never question everything. That's the idea they have. Or you are a questioning activist who want to go out and change society, and then what business do you have to be a nun? For years, I didn't know how to really solve this. Well, of course, I get one of the books we read. She says, I stay because I make the church better, and the church makes me better. But the way I finally solved that was that I found a 10-minute on YouTube presentation she has, and she has this beautiful Irish accent, and she said these jokes, really funny jokes. And suddenly, for the students, she became a real person. They listened to her. So it is really about finding a multiple, you know, multi-tiered methodology of bringing in approaches that show us that there is no either or. We have to really open up the horizon. I hope I can answer.
Prior to my appointment, I want to, in the spirit of playing and breaking open words, push back against any sort of use of science or the scientific method as this rigid, this rigid and unclaimed structure. In fact, and you address this, it says the scientific would have a more encompassing sense. What the gentleman here is discussing is the scientist fundamentalist approach to inquiry, which is sort of at odds with sort of scientific attitude and approach, which is really, as you pointed out, a poetic attitude or low attitude. So breaking that. But to return to a moment of Rumi remonstrating kings or sort of praising kings, where are you finding today this sort of poetic remonstrance? And then two, where are you finding joy? And three, what's making you laugh?
What was the last one?
What's making you laugh?
Oh, okay.
So, examples of poetic remonstrance, examples of joy, and then also
Right. Well, there is actually, all of these are present in the poems, in a book that I referred to, that I just finished on Saturday. I have a chapter called Sadie the Comedian, because this is about a long, continuous poem in which he starts a topic. He never leaves this topic. He starts, which is about complaining about the beloved, that returns to the refrain that says, now I'm going to forget about you and go back doing my own business. But this repeats about maybe 20, 20 different stanzas come, and he shows us 20 different funny ways to arrive at this conclusion in a poem which is only on that subject. In the poetry of Rumi, actually laughter is the greatest spiritual impulse. He says maybe the universe is that he compares the life of the universe into bursting into laughter. In fact, any kind of dynamic force presence in us or in nature around us, which isn't so easily manipulated by us, including laughter, for him has a spiritual dimension if we harness it properly. And you know, there was a tradition of praising kings and a tradition of reminding them of their limits. And the funniest thing is that the greatest critical moments can't be in those praises. Just because if the poet started writing, you know, starting from the beginning, you're such a terrible king, you're not, you know, this poem would not probably see the light of day, or not very many people would dare read it and publish it and so on, writing because the way of publishing. But the poem would begin with the beauty of nature, and this nature meets that great kind of commander, ruler, a just one, who realizes that life is short for everyone, including him, and coming gradually to what are the ways of staying in power if you're just, what foolish things you can do, and ending again with, well, thank God you realize, as a proper ruler, you realize that. So there is a huge body of this literature which has been almost entirely ignored by critics because they thought this was literature of praise. This was just giving, you know, free rein to the holders of power. And then there are many, many other anecdotes. There's an anecdote in which Sadi gives us a king who's singing in a palace, and you know, he's saying that the world was never be this beautiful. I don't have a single thing to worry about, no sorrows. And then someone from outside the palace says, well, if you don't have anything to worry about, maybe you should worry about me. And then the conversation begins between them in what Sadi does. And I wondered for a long time, how did this homeless person outside the palace survive so much in this literature? Because he uses the same elegant, educated, intelligent language that you find, in fact, is more compelling than the king when he talks. So the tradition has many different ways of bringing this up. There is a collection of short poems, quatrains of Rumi, called The Unseen Rain. If you don't have it, that's a very good place to look for all these nuances and funny things, wise things. It's very, very beautiful, beautifully done.
You mentioned, just as you began your remarks, about the peace community that was up in the context of the concerns about Iraq war, possible war with Iran. And I had a chance to read one of your poems that I found online that were a very touching poem about soldiers
In Fallujah.
Yes, soldiers and the people they interact with. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about how do you write a poem about such a sensitive and difficult situation, and what role do you see poetry in when we're trying to help our community reflect on war and the impact of war on the
No, I think one of the biggest disasters that could happen or begins to happen is when we separate ourselves from the other side, whether that is if it's a war or conflict, and begin to only focus on what is happening to us. And I always found it very, very sad when I was at airports and I would see these young soldiers, you know, flying to be in Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever they were. And particularly ever since I worked with the peace community and I worked with Veterans for Peace. And there was a wonderful gentleman, a veteran of the Vietnam War, and we had a routine tradition of crying together because he would be telling me something about the latest thing, that case of a PTSD or you know, an assault on a woman in the army, or whatever it was. And it would got usually to a point where it was really hard to speak. And I kept thinking, no, that's not right. One should speak about it. And to me, a mother whose son has lost an arm or a leg or died is as much a war prisoner as someone who may be put in Guantanamo Bay or some other place, wherever the terrible prison in Iraq was. So, unless we, you know, and he's very emotional, I can hardly read that poem myself. But it actually came out. And once when I was traveling to the campus, probably in Michigan, actually, and I wasn't going to be a part of the presentation that I gave them, and there were veterans in the audience. So it just, there are moments where you have to allow yourself to be vulnerable. I think poetry is about accepting your weakness, which is the source of your strength. So, you know, there are times when we just have to look at these wounds that we are suffering from. And I see that as the only way we have, you know, to look at Israel and Palestine as if they were the exact same place, even though, you know, a lot of people say, you know, even as the army that one side has, these things, these details may be true. The people who are suffering in this, we have to see them on the same level in order to be able to. Thank you for mentioning that point. Very close to my heart. Oh, by the way, sorry, it's called Giggling in Fallujah. And so if you want to look it up.
Yes, coming back to the question, very often people think if you are spiritual, you shouldn't be angry, you shouldn't be protesting, you shouldn't be out in the streets. It's almost like anti-spiritual to do that. I know, like we mentioned, hilarity and holiness are not mutually exclusive. But how do we really get this across? That you could be out there protesting, saying poetry, reciting poetry in the streets, and also be deeply spiritual at the same time.
Well, that's the point that came out with Joan Chittister. Everyone thought if she was a good nun, she shouldn't be really showing dissatisfaction for the way the society treated certain people and certain classes of people and so forth. Well, my solution, I mean, I think it took a while for me to give myself permission to express those things. I think the example of it is if you are a loving mother, you sometimes may really say something that is hard to hear. You may have to do that. If you are, you know, in a loving relationship with your husband, partner, whoever, you may sometimes do things that appear to be hurting bad. You can't be anything but what the truth is healed. You need to express it. I think what poetry can do, and coming together in loving, peaceful groups, is that from the beginning, they would rule out violence. To me, that is essential. If you rule out violence, you say, I am not going to hurt. I'm not going to kill. I'm not going to be destructive. Then I think that being angry, being dissatisfied, being outraged at some things that happen are very compassionate and very spiritual. Because you can't do it without that force. I mean, Rumi says about the force of love, he says it's destructive. The door is devastation. He says, think of yourself as a child. See, you were a child, you could only think about food and drink and comfort, and you grew up and there were more perceptions and thoughts. When you were older, your body, your existence accepted all of these. When you're older, King Love comes in and looks at you and says, this is no palace. I want a big palace that takes you apart and builds a palace out of you. So he doesn't talk about love as if it was this rosy, comfortable, with no need to express outrage or reveal himself in that way. So I see it as very spiritual, and I think as long as you know you're not going to be violent, then
Okay, we'll take one more question. I can see in Carl's face, he's going to ask the question.
Very simple question. Have you read Elif Shafak's The 40 Rules of Love?
the
40 Rules of Love?
no, I haven't.
You should read it. It's all about, I'm not sure, I'd love to hear, I wish I could hear your take on it, because it's all about Rumi. It's all about Rumi.
What is the name of the poem?
It's not a book of poetry. She's a novelist.
Okay, so what is the name of the author?
Elif Shafak.
Okay, I'm going to go look.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Could you all join me in thanking Dr. Keshavarz for her presentation?